So last year I ordered my first comic chest. The first comic chest. And the comic book story arc that they included was a Spider-Man arc that I'd never heard of before called Spider-Man Blue. Now, on the anniversary month of the first year of the comic chest, I'd like to tell you about this story arc. Since this 6-issue story arc, that's hard to say. 6-issue story arc. Since this 6-issue story arc isn't very well known, yes, and it's too sad to make a movie about, chances are you're not going to read it. So I'm just going to tell you what happens and explain to you why this Spider-Man story has become one of my favorites. Right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that this is a retelling of the old Stan Lee, Steve Ditko style Spider-Man stories. I say retelling because this is a story from Peter Parker's perspective, looking back at the events and kind of the love triangle that was happening between Peter Parker, Gwen Stacy, and Mary Jane. Then ultimately how the death of Gwen Stacy changed his life. Side note, if you know anything about Spider-Man, you should know that one of the biggest events of his life is when Gwen Stacy died. The Green Goblin tossed her off of a fucking bridge. Spider-Man tried to web sling and save her. He didn't do it right and broke her neck. Devastating loss for Peter Parker. This is the prelude to that. This is a unique and sad story, and I'm all about it. So let's begin, shall we? Chapter 1. This starts out with Peter Parker talking into a tape recorder, narrating the story, if you will. And he actually opens it up, briefly explaining the theme of this whole series. And basically the theme of Spider-Man's entire life. And that theme is, things have to get really, really bad before they can get good. The bad comes before the good. The good follows the bad. Then we open up the nice little splash page of Spider-Man swinging around. He talks about how it's Valentine's Day, and that reminds him of Gwen Stacy because back in the day, she sent him a Valentine on Valentine's Day. This page also reveals that this is Peter talking to Gwen through the tape recorder. You could say it's almost like a confession. Throughout this series, you'll find that on and off, he switches from storytelling mode to directly talking to Gwen. Then it shows him leaving a rose at the spot where Gwen died. He reveals that he does this every year. It's about remembering someone so important to me that I was going to spend the rest of my life with her. I didn't know that that meant that she would only get to spend the rest of her life with me. Sad. Peter thinks about the Green Goblin and the circumstances of that day, and how shitty it also was to find out that the Green Goblin is the father of his best friend. Norman Osborn is the father of Harry Osborn. He outwits and then beats the Goblin. Splunk wham bam. He talks about how strong the Green Goblin is. He discusses about how he almost killed the Goblin and how that was almost a relief for him. Instead, he knocked him into some good old-fashioned amnesia. After the fact, Peter visits Norman in the hospital. Obviously, Harry is there, and this is what begins their friendship as best buds. This is also when Peter notices Gwen Stacy looking at him. She came with some of the other friends of Harry's, and she was checking Peter out. Bounce over to Peter having a convo with sweet old Aunt May. Peter wants to save up for a motorcycle. They're talking about motorcycles and transportation. Guess what? She and dead Uncle Ben had already saved for a vehicle for Peter's future. So she gives Peter the money for the motorcycle that he wants. How sweet. Peter gets himself a motorcycle, and wouldn't you know it, he runs into Gwen in the gang. Peter offers up a ride on his new wheels, and Gwen fucking goes for it. But what's this? While Peter is out, an old friend stops by to visit. A lady friend. Unfortunately, Peter's out with Gwen Stacy. Chapter 2. We open up with Spider-Man reading about the Green Goblin being dead in the Daily Bugle. Keep in mind, he's still narrating the story talking into the tape recorder. Okay? He leaves the newsstand and a mysterious villain shows up, being all villainous. As Peter keeps checking up on Norman Osborn, he becomes better friends with Harry. And as he keeps taking college classes, he just keeps getting to know Gwen. It's really cute. They flirt. Flash Thompson picks on Peter per usual. Keep in mind, at this point, Peter doesn't actually think he could ever be with Gwen because Peter Parker, as you know, is us. Mystery Villain releases the Rhino from prison. This story does cover all the aspects of Peter Parker's life, and that includes working for J. Jonah Jameson at the Daily Bugle. JJ makes appearances and Peter gets those photographs for him. You know how it goes. Peter gets photographs of Spider-Man, JJ gives him money for the pictures, doesn't give Peter enough, blah, 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 blah. It's just a lot of banter and dialogue. You know how it goes. It's good. I'm just not gonna read all that to you. You can read it yourself. Spider-Man then takes on the Rhino, and his dialogue here is pretty funny. He talks about how he'd like to take Gwen out on a date, but he can't actually take Gwen out until he gets the money, and he can't get the money unless he gets pictures of himself getting beat up by the Rhino. Such is the vicious cycle of Peter Parker being Spider-Man. Also, the mysterious villain is watching the fight from the shadows. Peter brings a fucking building down on the Rhino and manages to get a sample of his hide. Let's take that sample to Dr. Kirk Connors. See what we're doing here? All the classic Spider-Man rogues making their way into the story. Dr. Connors and Peter develop a special webbing that's able to melt the Rhino's suit, and by the time he unburies himself, boom! Defeated. There's a sweet little dialogue here where Peter talks about how while he was fighting one of the strongest villains he's ever met, all he could think about was Gwen Stacy. He just can't get Gwen off his mind. He's just thinking about Gwen all the time. Aw. Then, as we wrap up things here in Chapter 2, Peter getting dressed up to go out with Gwen and the gang. Then as he's leaving, he opens up the door and holy fucking shit. Mary Jane Watson is standing there. Chapter 3, back to the tape recorder. Peter talks about how when it comes to these two girls, he was kind of an idiot. He absolutely loved Gwen first. No argument there. But MJ was around, and he noticed. She was just kind of wild for him back in those days, you know. Peter ends up taking MJ with to meet Gwen and the gang, and she makes it a point to make Gwen jealous. Peter and MJ are talking about how hot Gwen is, and then all of a sudden, a news flash hits the TV. The Lizard is at it again! Did anyone else see that one coming? MJ says, "Hey Peter, aren't you supposed to be taking pictures of this kind of thing?" And he's like, "Yeah, I better go." And she's like, "Okay, I'm coming with." They take off and leave Gwen behind. Kind of a baller move, if you asked me. They get to the scene of the crime, and as Peter Parker Spider-Mans it up, he lets us in on a little tidbit about himself, about how when he faces a personal problem, he likes to go web-slinging to clear his head. Spider-Man then finds the Lizard, wham bonk thwack. A train breaks up the fight, and the mysterious villain helps the Lizard escape. After this skirmish, Peter finds MJ, and she kisses his boo-boo. Then he Peter Parkers the fuck out of it and says he's gotta run and develop the photos he just took. Obviously, this is an excuse because he knows where the Lizard went and he's gonna go find him. I like this little part because Peter explains how the Lizard doesn't actually know that he's Kirk Connors. Peter gives us these little tidbits throughout the story on the villains, and I like that. And the fight resumes. Spider-Man freezes the feisty reptile, then gives him a dose of anti-serum. The Lizard becomes Kirk Connors again and then reunites with the fam. When Peter goes home, Harry's waiting for him on the doorstep. He then asks Peter to be his roommate. I mean, come on. Harry Osborn is rich as fuck. A free penthouse seems like a sweet deal. After that, Harry asks Peter, "Hey, what's going on with that MJ chick?" And then he tells Peter, "Hey, that Gwen Stacy, she's India, man." And Peter's like, "What?" Another sweet moment at the end here when Harry asks Peter to be his roommate. The very first thought that Peter had about that situation was Aunt May and how she would get on living without him. These are small moments throughout the series that show how Peter Parker, at his core, always considers other people before himself. Especially when it comes to Aunt May, because she's just the sweetest old lady ever. Chapter 4. We open up with a super sweet convo between Peter and Aunt May. They're both nervous about the conversation that they're about to have. She asks, with him away at college, would it be okay with him for Mary Jane's aunt to move in with her? Then proceeds to tell Peter that he should move in with Harry. Aunt May already knows, and she spares Peter from the guilt of asking to move out. She's the best. Cut to Peter with a tape recorder again. He just goes ahead and shatters this wonderful moment by saying he never would have thought that he would have to bury Gwen before he would have to bury Aunt May. Jesus, Peter. Let's go to prison. Something's up with the Vulture. He just keeps coughing. He's sick. Something's going on. Is he gonna die? Who knows? This other inmate convinces him to divulge where the Vulture wings are hidden at because, you know, he thinks he's dying. Cut to Peter dropping off Aunt May at MJ's aunt's house. He admits that there are advantages to seeing MJ's aunt so much. Maybe you know what I'm saying. And suddenly, Harry swings by to pick up MJ. They're becoming an item. Back to prison. That random guy escaped and finds his way to the vulture wings. Just like that, we got ourselves a new vulture, folks. How was he able to get out of prison and convince the vulture to divulge the information of where the vulture wings were? Because he had a deal with the mysterious villain. Spider-Man swinging by Harry's new bachelor pad, that's soon to be his new apartment. Just checking to see what's up. Gwen and the gang are there. They're having a housewarming party of sorts. Then before he can find a spot to change and then go join the party, Spider-Man's web gets cut. He got caught totally off guard, and then he takes a surprisingly decent beating. Cut to the party. Peter's running late. Back to the fight. Clang! Spider-Man notices it's a new younger vulture and starts quipping it up. He then gets kicked all the way down to a rooftop. Then he admits that he was thinking at the time that he let his friends and Gwen down for not showing up to the party. Ah, Peter. Chapter 5! Peter shows up after the party, looking like shit. Check out this new penthouse he's living in. What? Harry shows Peter his room. He passes out. And then we get the mystery villain finding out that Spider-Man survived his fall. Mystery villain's not happy about this, so he goes back to the old Vulture. He's upset that new Vulture didn't kill Spider-Man, so he makes old Vulture better. Original Vulture, making a comeback, baby! Peter's still feeling like shit, but no worries. MJ shows up to make him feel better. She's getting a strong flirt on when Gwen fucking Stacy shows up. And what does Peter do when he's got two chicks fighting for his attention? He says he doesn't feel good and he needs to rest. So they leave. Come on, man. In reality, he bailed on the ladies because he saw two vultures fighting outside. And then he thought maybe Spider-Man should ask him some questions. Splash page, and then shit gets quippy. Thrash! Spidey takes them both out at the same time. Peter returns to his penthouse, but what's this? The mystery villain is able to get a scent of him and follows him back. Bum bum bum! Chapter 6, Peter is talking to the tape recorder again, and while this dialogue is going on, the mystery villain is looking back at all the villains that Spider-Man has defeated. The dialogue of this chapter is definitely the most forward when it comes to Peter talking directly to Gwen. And I'm not gonna lie, it's heavy. Peter is telling Gwen about how unfair life can be, and this is after he had a dream that Gwen never died. Jesus, man. God. Then back to our story. It's Valentine's Day, and Peter gets a Valentine, but it's unsigned. We got a mystery Valentine, folks. There's a small side story in this that I kind of just skipped over, but Flash Thompson got saved by Spider-Man, and that inspired him to become a hero in his own way, so he decides to join the army. So Harry is throwing a send-off party for Flash at their swanky apartment, and mystery villain breaks in. It's Kraven the Hunter. Nobody saw that coming. What a total surprise. He kidnapped Harry. Oh no. He mistakenly kidnapped Harry thinking he was Peter because Peter's wearing the same cologne as Harry because Peter let Harry borrow his cologne from earlier. Spider-Man catches up, then thunk, ram, brack, clunk. Spider-Man pretty easily defeats Kraven, and then Kraven admits that he was hired by the Green Goblin originally, and he was carrying out the assignment that he agreed to. Peter returns home, and Gwen walks in on him changing, and we find out that the unsigned Valentine earlier was from her. And they fuck. And the story that we know carries on from there. This is how Peter and Gwen started dating. Then the comic book cuts to Peter sitting in his attic, talking to the tape recorder. And this part is the genius of Spider-Man Blue. These last couple pages are what brings everything together. Peter's talking to Gwen here, and he's trying to make sense of what possible good could ever have come from her death. And that is something that just weighs on him heavily. Peter ends up telling Gwen that her death changed Mary Jane. It made her realize that life is not a party. Gwen's death caused Mary Jane Watson to become the woman that Peter falls in love with, and eventually that woman becomes his wife. Then MJ enters the room. She's been listening to Peter's conversation. Peter apologizes, and then she just drops the most heart-wrenching dialogue of the entire comic series. Will you do me a favor, Peter? Say hello for me, and tell Gwen I miss her too. Peter says hi for MJ, and then he talks about how this time of year, every year, he feels blue. Then he stops the tape recorder, and that's the end of the series. That's Spider-Man Blue by Joseph Loeb and Tim Sale. I love this series. It's part of their Color series that also includes Daredevil Yellow, Hulk Gray, and Captain America White. Spider-Man Blue is honestly a great series to start out reading Spider-Man comics. If you want to kick off reading Spider-Man comics, that's a good place to begin. It gives you a quick, concise rundown of the Spider-Man Rogues Gallery and how Spider-Man interacts and typically defeats these villains. It's also a great history lesson from a different perspective. As far as the character of Spider-Man himself, this is a great way to show you exactly who that character is. The artwork is great. They make it look like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko drew it in the 70s. When shit starts to get sad at the end, they turn all the panels a tint of blue, and I love that. The perspective of Peter reminiscing about the early days between Gwen and MJ is so heavy because that was a time that's now lost. The death of Gwen changed everyone. And when Gwen died, obviously that was a huge moment for Spider-Man and that character. But you don't really think about how MJ lost a dear friend. And the reason that her friend died was because her fucking future husband couldn't save her. That's some heavy shit to think about. And the fact that MJ asked Peter to say hi to Gwen for her, it was a way of telling Peter that he's not alone in this. They're both sad about what happened, but she lets him know that they're in this together. Another aspect of this comic that fleshed out the Spider-Man character is how when Peter is Spider-Man, everything comes natural to him. He's a natural at fighting these villains, and for the most part, he defeated them without much struggle. Being Spider-Man is the easier part of Peter's life. It's being Peter Parker that's hard. Peter Parker is the one that carries the burdens of Spider-Man's actions. Peter Parker's the one that becomes a disappointment to his friends because he's off making the choice to save people. He also doesn't question that choice. Being Spider-Man is always the priority. This overlooked series truly shows every aspect of the Spider-Man character and how hard the death of his girlfriend was. It shows how Mary Jane was always there for him, how that death changed her, and how she's still there for him. To take that old material and tell it through this new perspective, a cassette tape confession therapy session is just brilliant. I know I basically covered all of it, but I still think it's worth reading it yourself. Just to read Peter's dialogue to Gwen is heartbreaking, and it hits your feels in a way that comic books rarely do. As I said way in the beginning, this is a unique comic book, and it's a rare experience as a comic book reader. It's an easy read, and you should probably check it out. Just be aware of that punch in the gut at the end. Spider-Man is sad. He's got the blues. Spider-Man Blue. Okay. See ya. Subscribe.